The Newport coastline at sunset is usually a masterpiece, but today all I see are the jagged cracks in a legacy I thought was ironclad. I'm Kira, a 29-year-old art restorer. In my world, a single misplaced stroke of a brush or a 1 millimeter deviation isn't just an error, it's a forgery. I've spent my career spotting lies hidden under layers of paint, yet I never expected the most dangerous counterfeit to be sitting on my own mahogany desk. "Everything is for the family," my mother whispered, her voice as cold as the Atlantic. "Just sign it," my husband Garrett added, sliding the paper toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They think I'm breaking down. They think the emotional instability they've been whispering about has finally clouded my judgment. They want me to hand over the Eleanor Trust, my grandmother's legacy, to my younger sister Macy, all because of a sudden pregnancy and a supposed need for stability." I held the pen, watching them breathe a collective sigh of relief. But as my eyes traced the signature on the authorization form Garrett gave me last month, my blood ran cold. The ink was right, the flow was similar, but the pressure was wrong. A stroke that should have tapered was blunt. My grandmother didn't sign this. Someone else did. I looked up at the people I called family, realizing that the betrayal didn't start with an affair or a secret child. It started with a pen. I set the document down, my voice steady, as I prepared to reveal that the game they were playing was about to collapse under the weight of a single forged line. "Do you trust your intuition, or do you believe the version of reality others paint for you? Have you ever uncovered a massive web of lies from one tiny overlooked detail?" Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to know if I'm the only one standing in a house of cards. The heavy oak doors of the private study groaned as I stepped inside, the rich scent of dark roast coffee and expensive furniture polish, doing little to mask the clinical coldness radiating from the three people waiting for me. My mother, Beverly, 56, sat behind the mahogany desk like a judge presiding over a sentencing, her spine a rigid line of Newport breeding. To her left was my younger sister Macy, 24, draped in a silk wrap that couldn't quite hide the smug curve of her lips as she cradled a porcelain mug. Garrett stood by the window, his silhouette blocking the morning sun, casting a long, dark shadow that stretched across the Persian rug to touch the tips of my shoes. There were no greetings. No, "Good morning, Kira." Instead, Beverly slid a thick manila folder across the polished surface. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The letterhead of a prominent psychiatric clinic in Providence was visible through the translucent cover. "We've all noticed it, Kira." Beverly began, her voice a practiced melody of artificial concern. "The erratic behavior, the obsession with your restoration projects at the expense of your social obligations, the fragility. It's become clear to the family and to the board of the Eleanor Trust that you are suffering from high-functioning clinical depression. You are simply no longer in a state to manage a legacy of this magnitude." I felt the air thin in the room. This was the opening move, the classic Newport execution. They weren't just asking for a divorce. They were attempting to strip me of my legal agency, painting me as mentally incompetent to ensure I couldn't contest the changes Garrett had been making to the fund. Garrett finally turned, his face etched with a mask of performative grief that made my stomach churn. "I've tried to protect you from this reality for months, honey. But with Macy's current condition, with a new life to consider, we have to think about the stability of the entire estate. We can't have the foundation of our family's future resting on someone so unstable." Macy leaned forward, her voice a sharp contrast to my mother's velvet tones. "It's for the best, Kira. Garrett and I are going to marry as soon as the decree is finalized. He's already been managing your half of the assets anyway. It only makes sense for him to take over full control so you can focus on your recovery in a private facility we've already researched for you." The audacity was breathtaking. Under Rhode Island law, if they could prove I was incapacitated or mentally unfit, they could petition for a conservatorship, effectively turning me into a ghost in my own life. They weren't just taking my husband, They were attempting to hijack my legal existence to cover the hemorrhage of funds Beverly had lost in her failing real estate ventures. I looked at the divorce papers resting atop the psychiatric report. The ink on the signature line seemed to pulse like a warning. They expected me to break. They expected the fragile Kira they'd spent years cultivating to simply curl up and surrender to their mercy. But as I stared at Garrett, I saw the subtle flicker of anxiety in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cufflinks. He knew about the forged signature I'd discovered. He knew he was standing on a fault line. "You speak of stability as if it's a commodity you can trade," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. I didn't look at the papers. I looked directly at my mother, who hadn't blinked since I entered. "And you speak of my energy as if it's a liability. But tell me, Garrett, when you discussed my instability with the clinic, did you also mention the thousands of dollars moved from the trust's offshore account last Tuesday? Or perhaps Macy mentioned how her needs necessitated a legal merger that bypasses the audit my grandmother specifically mandated." The color drained from Macy's face, her mug clattering against the saucer. Beverly's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint replacing the fake sympathy. "Kira, don't be difficult. This isn't a negotiation, it's an intervention. Sign the papers, accept the treatment, and we will ensure you are taken care of. Fight this, and we will be forced to take this to the probate court. You know how the local papers love a Newport scandal involving a mad heiress." Garrett stepped toward me, his hand reaching out in a gesture that was supposed to be comforting but felt like a threat. "Listen to your mother. We just want to save the family reputation. Don't make us do something we'll all regret." I stood my ground, the weight of the forged document in my mind providing a spine of steel. They thought they were gaslighting a victim. They didn't realize they were talking to a restorer who knew exactly how to strip away the varnish to reveal the rot underneath. The realization didn't hit me like a sudden storm. It was more like the slow, agonizing process of cleaning a centuries-old oil painting, where the grime of decades finally peels away to reveal a grotesque distortion underneath. As I stared at the blank wall of my studio later that day, the pieces of Beverly's desperate puzzle began to lock into place with terrifying precision. For 3 years, my mother had been playing a high-stakes game of financial smoke and mirrors, and the Eleanor Trust, the fund meant to preserve our family's cultural legacy, had become her personal casino. I remembered the subtle shifts in her lifestyle that I had once dismissed as typical Newport extravagance. There were the private jet charters to Aspen, the charity galas that seemed more like personal celebrations, and the sudden acquisition of a sprawling vineyard in Sonoma that was never mentioned in the family's quarterly reports. At the time, I was too buried in my restoration projects to notice the math didn't add up. Beverly didn't have independent wealth. She had access. And as the primary trustee, she had been treating my grandmother's ironclad stipulations like mere suggestions. The logic of their current aggression was now sickeningly clear. Under the original terms of the trust, a mandatory independent audit was triggered the moment I reached 30, or if there was a change in the primary management. I was 29. The clock was ticking and the ledger was bleeding. Beverly had invested millions into a series of high-risk commercial real estate ventures in Florida that had cratered during the recent market correction. If I remained in power, I would eventually see the gaping hole where 25% of the principal used to be. She wasn't just facing social ruin, she was facing a federal investigation for fiduciary negligence and embezzlement. That was where Garrett came in. My husband was never just a man I loved. He was a strategic acquisition for my mother. With his background in complex real estate structured finance, he was the only one capable of moving the remaining assets around fast enough to hide the deficit. But he couldn't do that while I held the veto power. By forcing a divorce and declaring me mentally incompetent, they could bypass the audit entirely. If Garrett married Macy and became the co-trustee, he could merge the Eleanor Trust with his own investment firm, effectively burying the evidence of Beverly's theft under layers of new corporate filings. It explained why Macy was so eager to play the role of the pregnant, blushing bride. She was the vessel for their survival. My sister had always lived for the immediate thrill of the buy, never the long-term cost of the debt. She didn't care about the legacy. She cared about the million-dollar wedding and the social standing that came with being the new matriarch of the Eleanor estate. They were a triumvirate of greed bound together by the need to silence the one person who still cared about the integrity of the family name. I thought back to the authorization form Garrett had tried to slip past me weeks ago. It wasn't just a simple power of attorney, it was a blanket waiver for the upcoming audit. The forged signature of my late grandmother Eleanor on the backdated codicil was their insurance policy. If I had signed it, I would have been legally complicit in their crimes. They had been gaslighting me not just to take my husband, but to turn me into their silent partner in a felony. The sheer scale of the betrayal made my hands tremble, but my mind remained unnervingly sharp. In restoration, when you find a section of a canvas that has been painted over to hide a tear, you don't just patch it. You document the damage. You gather the evidence. You prepare for the long, meticulous process of stripping away the lies. Garrett believed his financial expertise made him untouchable. Beverly believed her social status made her immune to consequences. They both saw me as a fragile artist who lived in a world of aesthetics, incapable of understanding the brutal reality of a balance sheet. They were wrong. I understood perfectly. Every dollar they had moved left a digital shadow. Every investment they made had a paper trail. And most importantly, Garrett's firm was subject to the same federal regulations he was trying to circumvent. If I could link the trust's losses to his firm's sudden growth, I wouldn't just be stopping a marriage, I would be dismantling an empire. The Eleanor Trust was meant to protect history, not fund a cover-up. As I sat in the gathering shadows of my studio, I realized that the instability they were so worried about wasn't mine. It was theirs. The foundation of their world was built on a lie, and I was the only one who knew exactly where to strike to make the whole structure crumble. A cold, calculated stillness settled over me as I stepped back into the shared home office that Garrett and I had occupied for 6 years. To anyone else, it was just a room filled with monitors and filing cabinets, but to me, it was now a crime scene waiting to be deconstructed. My training as a restorer had taught me that the truth is never truly gone. It is merely buried under layers of ego and convenience. I reached for my encrypted laptop and connected the forensic bridge device that Julian 30, a sharp-witted attorney and a friend from my university days in Providence, had provided under the strictest veil of confidentiality. Julian had been a constant, steady shadow in my life, his legal mind as sharp as my scalpel. When I had called him after the confrontation at the Beverly Mansion, he hadn't offered empty platitudes. Instead, he had provided a list of specialized software and the contact information for an independent forensic auditing firm located in New York City, far outside the reach of the Newport social circle and my stepfather's local influence. "If we are going to do this, Kira," he had warned through the receiver, "we have to be invisible. If Garrett catches a glimpse of the audit before we are ready, he will burn the servers to the ground." The soft hum of the external drive felt like a heartbeat in the silent room. I began by bypassing the primary operating system, accessing the hidden partitions where Garrett assumed his digital fingerprints were erased. My eyes, trained to find the minute inconsistencies in a Renaissance brushstroke, scanned the metadata of the authorization forms he had pressured me to sign. It didn't take long to find the anomaly. A digital signature from my grandmother Eleanor dated 3 months after her funeral. The timestamp was a crude overlay, a sloppy piece of digital forgery that might have fooled a bank teller, but it stood out to me like a neon sign. Garrett had used a high-resolution scan of an old holiday card to lift her signature, unaware that the ink density in the scan didn't match the digital canvas he had pasted it onto. My breath hitched as I navigated deeper into the encrypted ledgers. I found the shadow accounts entities with innocuous names like Newport Heritage Investments that were actually empty shells used to siphon capital from the trust. The money trail was a jagged line of betrayal. $3 million had been moved in a series of administrative fees and consulting payments directly into a private account held in Macy's name. This wasn't just a cover-up for Beverly's real estate failures. It was a systematic looting of the estate to fund the lavish lifestyle my sister felt entitled to. I worked with a surgeon's precision, cloning the entire server and mirroring the outgoing transaction logs. I could see the panic in Garrett's digital trail, the frantic attempts to reroute funds as the date for the mandatory audit approached. He was trying to create a paper bridge over a canyon of debt using my supposed instability as the primary scaffolding. I packaged the data into a secure cloud link and sent it to the New York auditors Julian had secured. The firm, a powerhouse specializing in white-collar crime, was already on standby. "The signatures are the smoking gun," I whispered to the empty room, my fingers dancing over the keys to erase any trace of my presence. "And the Macy accounts are the motive." I met Julian later that evening at a quiet diner in Warwick, a 30-minute drive from the suffocating atmosphere of Newport. He sat in a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room with a lawyer's habitual caution. I slid the flash drive across the table concealed beneath a napkin. "The New York team has already started the preliminary scan of the cloud link," Julian said, his voice low and urgent. "They found a series of wire transfers that violate the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO). This is bigger than a divorce, Kira. This is federal territory. If we present this to the board of the Eleanor Trust now, they'll have no choice but to freeze every asset associated with Garrett and your mother." "No," I replied, a chilling clarity settling in my chest. "Not yet. If the assets are frozen now, Beverly will find a way to spin it. She'll blame it on a rogue employee or my mental breakdown causing a bank error. I want them to walk into the office of the probate judge thinking they've won. I want them to stand there ready to take everything before the floor falls out from under them." Julian leaned back, a grim smile touching his lips. "You're playing a dangerous game, Kira. You're staying in that house with a man who is actively trying to erase your legal existence." "He doesn't see me, Julian. He sees a fragile artist who is too unstable to check a balance sheet." I said, my voice as hard as flint. "And that is exactly why he's going to lose." I left the diner and drove back toward the coast, the dark Atlantic churning to my right. The restoration was no longer about paint and canvas. It was about stripping away the gold-leafed lies of the Newport elite until only the raw, ugly truth remained. Every mile I traveled brought me closer to the confrontation, and for the first time in months I didn't feel like a victim. I was the master of the reveal, and the unveiling was going to be devastating. The familiar weight of my black titanium credit card felt like a piece of useless plastic when the waiter at my local cafe returned it with a sympathetic yet wary expression. It was the first sign that the cage doors were officially locking. Garrett hadn't just moved out. He was systematically erasing my footprints from the very life we had built together. By the time I returned to the house, my key fob refused to engage the deadbolt. The security system, a high-end integrated network I had helped program, now flashed a steady, taunting red. I stood on the cobblestone driveway, realizing that the man I had shared a bed with for 6 years was now treating me like a trespasser in my own home. A text message arrived shortly after, its tone dripping with a poisonous blend of pity and control. "Kira, I've moved your essentials to the studio. Given your current mental state, I've consulted with Beverly and your doctors. We've placed a temporary hold on all joint accounts to ensure you don't make any impulsive financial decisions that could jeopardize your long-term care. It's for your own protection, honey." The protection felt more like an execution. When I tried to log into my workstation at the museum, a system-generated alert informed me that my administrative privileges had been revoked, pending a fitness for duty review. Beverly's influence in Newport was a silent, pervasive fog. She had spent decades funding the museum's gala dinners. A single phone call from her expressing deep concern for her daughter's deteriorating stability was enough to paralyze my career. I was being ghosted by my own profession. Newport is a town built on whispers, and the rumor mill was already churning with a carefully curated narrative. At the local market, former friends who used to invite me to their yachts suddenly found the labels on wine bottles incredibly fascinating the moment I walked into an aisle. Garrett and Beverly were playing a masterful hand of social chess. They weren't just taking my assets, they were taking my credibility. By framing my discovery of their fraud as the delusions of a paranoid breakdown, they were preemptively disarming me. Every time I tried to speak the truth, it was dismissed as another symptom of my instability. I had no choice but to retreat to my restoration studio, a small, drafty brick building on the edge of the harbor that had been a wedding gift from my grandmother. It was the only property that remained solely in my name, a legal oversight by Garrett that I now thanked Eleanor for every hour. The space was cluttered with the skeletons of old furniture and the pungent scent of linseed oil, but as I hauled my remaining suitcases through the door, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a workshop. It was a war room. I pinned the mirrored transaction logs I had cloned earlier to the large corkboard normally reserved for sketching structural repairs on 18th-century armoires. Seeing the jagged lines of the trust's deficit pinned against the wall gave the betrayal a physical shape. Garrett thought that by cutting off my access to the high society circles of Rhode Island, he was cutting off my oxygen. He didn't realize that I had spent my entire life learning how to breathe in the dust of the past. Macy's social media was a relentless parade of triumph. She posted photos of nursery planning in the guest wing of my former home, wearing the vintage pearls that Beverly had promised me for my 30th birthday. The comments were filled with Newport's elite offering congratulations on the brave new chapter and sending prayers for my healing. The cruelty of their performative kindness was a sharp, cold blade. They were celebrating a union built on theft while I was being buried alive in a narrative I didn't write. But the isolation had a hidden benefit: it made me invisible to them. Garrett was so convinced of his victory, so certain, that I was cowering in a corner of the studio in a state of clinical despair that he became sloppy. He began using our old shared Amazon account to order expensive prenatal equipment and designer maternity wear, assuming I was too broken to check the notifications. Every purchase was a time-stamped piece of evidence of his cohabitation with Macy while we were still legally married. I spent the nights under the harsh glow of a single halogen lamp connecting the dots between the Florida real estate failures and the wire transfers to Macy's private offshore holdings. I wasn't just looking for the money anymore, I was looking for the ego. Garrett believed he was the smartest person in any room, but he had forgotten that a restorer's greatest asset is patience. You cannot rush the removal of a false layer. You have to wait for the solvent to work. The mask of perfection that Beverly and Garrett wore for the public was beginning to crack under the weight of their own greed. They wanted me to be the madwoman in the attic, but I was the auditor in the shadows. As the fog rolled in off the Atlantic, shrouding the harbor in gray, I felt a strange sense of peace. The social suicide they had forced upon me had stripped away everything but my resolve. I had no house, no accounts, and no reputation left to lose. And in the legal landscape of America, there is nothing more dangerous than a woman who has already been stripped of her fear. The boardroom of Harrison's law firm was a cathedral of dark mahogany and silent judgments overlooking the gray, churning harbor of Newport. A single long conference table separated my past from my future. On one side sat Beverly, draped in Chanel and wearing a face of practiced solemnity, flanked by Garrett, who looked every bit the successful executive in his bespoke navy suit. Macy was tucked beside him, her hand resting conspicuously on her abdomen, her eyes shimmering with a victory she believed she had already secured. Across from them, I sat alone, my presence a mere formality in their eyes, the broken heiress invited only to sign away her life. Everything is for the family. Beverly repeated, her voice a soft hypnotic lure as she slid the final transfer documents toward me. Sign the papers, Kira. Let's put this unfortunate chapter behind us so you can focus on your recovery. Garrett added a nod of synthetic empathy, his pen already uncapped and waiting for my hand. It's a generous settlement, Kira. You'll have enough to live comfortably in a quiet facility without the burden of managing assets you clearly can't handle right now. Macy leaned forward, a thin, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Think of the baby, Kira. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about ensuring the Eleanor legacy doesn't crumble because of your recent lapses. I stared at the signature line, the gold nib of the fountain pen reflecting the cold morning light. For a moment the room was so silent I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock against the far wall. Then I set the pen down. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the stillness. I've spent the last decade restoring artifacts. I began, my voice steady, devoid of the fragility they expected. I know how to spot a masterwork, and I know how to spot a desperate forgery. And what I see in this room isn't a family protecting a legacy. It's a group of vultures trying to incinerate the paper trail of their own crimes. Garrett's expression shifted from pity to a hard, jagged defensiveness. Kira, you're drifting again. This is exactly the kind of paranoia the doctors warned us about. Instead of answering, I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out a heavy spiral-bound folder, the final report from the New York auditing firm Julian had secured. I slammed it onto the mahogany surface, sliding it directly into the center of the table like a grenade. This is an independent forensic audit of the Eleanor Trust for the past 36 months. I said, my gaze locking onto Beverly, whose hand had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. It details a shortfall of $4.8 million. It tracks wire transfers from the principal accounts directly into shell companies used to bail out failing real estate developments in Florida, developments owned exclusively by my mother. The air left the room. Garrett reached for the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it. There is more. I continued, my voice rising with a chilling clarity. I also have a forensic digital analysis of the authorization forms you used to bypass the quarterly reviews. My grandmother's signature was digitally grafted from a 20-year-old holiday card. The metadata proves the document was created 48 hours after the losses in Florida were finalized. It's not just fraud, Garrett, it's a federal felony. Macy let out a sharp, scoffing laugh that sounded brittle and terrified. This is insane. You're making things up because you're bitter about the divorce. Mom, tell her how crazy this is. But Beverly was silent. She was staring at the report as if it were a ghost. I turned my attention back to the man I had once trusted with my heart and my future. There is one person who has been abusing the family trust for 3 years to cover up financial crimes, and that person is not me. I stated, the hook hanging in the air like a guillotine. Garrett, you didn't marry me for love, and you're not marrying Macy for a family. You're marrying her because she's the only vessel left to merge this trust into your firm and bury the evidence of your complicity in my mother's embezzlement. You think by declaring me mentally unfit, the audit disappears. But the New York firm has already sent a copy of this report to the state's attorney and the Board of Trustees. Garrett stood up, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. You have no proof of digital forgery. This is a stunt, Kira. You're a restorer, not a forensic accountant. I am someone who knows how to see what's hidden in the layers, Garrett. I replied, standing up to meet his eyes. And I've seen enough. I am not signing the divorce decree on your terms. I am not signing the transfer of the Eleanor Trust. In fact, Julian is filing an emergency injunction in the probate court as we speak to freeze every account associated with your firm until a court-appointed receiver can verify where that $4.8 million went. Macy's face went a sickly shade of gray, her hand dropping from her stomach, as she realized the wealth she was marrying into was a burning house. Beverly looked at me then, not with motherly concern, but with a visceral, jagged hatred that finally confirmed everything I had suspected. The mask of the perfect Newport matriarch had shattered, and the person underneath was a stranger. "You've destroyed the family, Kira," Beverly hissed, her voice a low, venomous rasp. "You've aired our laundry to outsiders. No one in this town will ever look at you again." "I don't care about this town, Mother," I said, picking up my satchel. "And as for the family, you destroyed that, the moment you decided my grandmother's legacy was your personal slush fund. I'm not the unstable one here. I'm the only one who survived the rot." I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the silence behind me heavy with the weight of their crumbling empire. They were no longer the architects of my fate. They were just people sitting in a room waiting for the police to arrive. The air in the boardroom didn't just grow cold. It became toxic, thick with the stench of a dying empire and the desperate, frantic gasps of people realizing that the floor had finally vanished beneath them. I stood at the threshold watching as the elegant facade of the Newport elite dissolved into something primal and ugly. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction. Garrett, usually the picture of composed corporate ambition, was the first to snap. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket as he turned on Beverly, his face contorted with a jagged, hysterical fear. "I didn't want any of this," he roared, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at my mother. "She pressured me. Kira Beverly told me the fund was already bleeding, and that if I didn't help her restructure the Eleanor Trust, we would all be in federal prison by the end of the year. She was the one who suggested the digital signature scans. She said she had the original holiday cards in the attic. I was just trying to fix her mess to keep this family from drowning in her Florida real estate debt." Beverly didn't flinch, though her eyes were wide and glazed, reflecting a soul that had finally run out of lies. "You coward!" she hissed, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "You were more than happy to take your management fees from those offshore transfers, Garrett. You saw an opportunity to swallow the trust into your firm, and you jumped at it. Don't play the martyr now when you've been measuring the curtains for Kira's office for months." Macy sat frozen between them, her face a sickly, pallid mask of realization. But as the legal implications of federal felony and RICO began to sink in her survival instinct, the same selfish drive that had led her to my husband's bed flared into life. She realized that the man she had banked her entire future on was ready to throw everyone under the bus to save his own skin. "You were going to leave me, weren't you?" Macy's voice was small, but it cut through their shouting like a razor. She pulled her smartphone from her designer clutch, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "I knew you were a liar, Garrett. I knew you were too sloppy to be trusted. That's why I started recording our late-night planning sessions." She pressed play, and the room was suddenly filled with Garrett's tinny, arrogant voice echoing from the speakers. "Once the conservatorship is finalized and Kira is in the facility, we'll move the remainder of the principal to the Cayman accounts. Macy, you're just the distraction. Beverly thinks I'm saving her, but once the merger is complete, I'm filing for a quiet annulment. I'm not spending the rest of my life tied to a spoiled brat and a failing socialite." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Garrett's heavy, uneven breathing. Macy looked at him with a visceral loathing that mirrored my own, but hers was born of spite, not betrayal. "I'm not going to jail for you, Garrett. I've already sent copies of these recordings to Julian's office. If I'm going down for the money in my account, I'm making sure you never see the light of day again." It was a spectacle of absolute moral bankruptcy. Garrett lunged toward the phone, but Harrison's security detail intervened, pinning him against the mahogany table where he had just been presiding as the new master of the house. He began to sob, not out of remorse, but out of the sheer pathetic terror of a man who had finally run out of people to manipulate. Beverly sank back into her chair, the Chanel suit looking like a shroud. She looked at Macy, then at Garrett, and finally at me. For the first time in my life, I saw her without the varnish of Newport society. She was just an aging, desperate woman who had sold her daughter's soul to pay for a lifestyle she couldn't afford. The perfect family she had fought so hard to preserve was currently tearing itself apart in front of a room full of lawyers and court reporters. "The Board of Trustees has already been notified," Julian stated, stepping into the room with a calm authority that signaled the end of the game. "Federal agents are currently at Garrett's firm and the Beverly estate. Every asset is being frozen under the preliminary injunction. You three won't be arguing over who gets what. You'll be arguing over who gets the least amount of prison time." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I didn't need to. I had watched the layers of their lies peel away until there was nothing left but the raw, rotting truth. As I walked out of the law firm, the sounds of their mutual accusations followed me down the hallway, a cacophony of greed and cowardice that no longer had any power over me. They were no longer a family. They were just co-defendants in a crumbling conspiracy. The restoration was complete, and for the first time in years, the air outside felt clean. The dust has finally settled over the harbor of Newport, but for me, the silence that followed the storm was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. True restoration is never a quick process. It's a slow, deliberate act of stripping away the fake to find the original strength underneath. I didn't walk away a millionaire overnight. In fact, one of my first legal acts after the boardroom confrontation was to request a full voluntary freeze on the Eleanor Trust. I wanted every cent scrutinized by the federal authorities, even if it meant I wouldn't touch a dollar of my inheritance for years. I didn't want the money if it was still stained by the fingerprints of their greed. I traded the haunted corridors of my former mansion for a small, sun-drenched studio in a quiet corner of New York City. The space is humble, a far cry from the Newport elite's gilded cages, but every tool in it belongs to me. There is a profound grounding peace in knowing that the coffee I drink and the rent I pay are funded by my own skill, not a family name. The social circles I once felt obligated to navigate have evaporated, replaced by a handful of genuine friends and a reputation for integrity that no amount of Beverly's gossip could ever tarnish. The consequences for those who tried to erase me have been as cold and calculated as the laws they broke. Garrett is currently navigating the labyrinth of a federal investigation into securities fraud and embezzlement. His bespoke suits have been replaced by the drab reality of court appearances, and his firm, the empire he tried to build on a foundation of stolen capital, has filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He didn't just lose a wife, he lost the one thing he valued most, his standing in the financial world. He is now a pariah in the very industry he tried to conquer. Beverly's fall from grace was perhaps the most public. To avoid the most severe criminal charges, she was forced to liquidate the majority of her personal assets to repay the trust's deficit. The vineyard in Sonoma, the private jets, and even the family estate in Newport were sold at auction. She lives now in a modest townhouse far from the coast, a woman whose name no longer opens doors. The perfect matriarch of Newport is now a cautionary tale whispered at the same galas she once presided over. As for Macy, the victory she believed she had stolen turned into a hollow, solitary struggle. Without the support of the trust or Garrett's vanished wealth, she was left to navigate the reality of her choices alone. The sisterhood we once shared is a casualty I've long since mourned, but I've chosen to remain in a state of absolute no contact. My life is no longer a resource for her to exploit. I recently finished my most important project, the restoration of the portrait of my grandmother Eleanor. I spent weeks carefully removing the yellowed varnish and the crude touch-ups that had obscured her true likeness for decades. As the final layer came off, her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and unyielding, seemed to meet mine. I realized then that freedom isn't about the balance of a bank account, it's about the clarity of one's own soul. I didn't just restore a painting, I restored my right to my own story. The legacy I carry forward isn't the money, but the courage to stand in the light of the truth, no matter how many people try to pull you into the shadows. Value and reflection for the audience. This story isn't just about a legal battle or a failed marriage. It's a testament to the fact that your worth is never defined by the people who try to diminish you. In a world that often prioritizes family harmony over justice, Kira's journey teaches us that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to burn the bridge to a toxic legacy. True independence isn't something that can be given to you in a trust fund. It's something you build with your own hands through the difficult, often lonely process of standing up for what is right. Kira lost a mansion but gained a life that actually belongs to her. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have stayed to try and fix the family, or would you have chosen the same path of absolute freedom? Does family always deserve a second chance? Even after a betrayal this deep? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.